The streets of Maplewood, a small American town, were unusually quiet that midnight. A biting chill swept through the air, rattling the windows of shuttered shops and forcing stray animals to huddle together for warmth. Jack, a 24-year-old mechanic, locked the creaky door of his rundown garage. His hands were blackened with grease, his shirt worn thin, and his boots scuffed from long days of work. Life had never been easy for him, but fixing cars was all he had known since his father passed away. Jack sighed deeply as he packed his old rusty toolbox into the back of his pickup. All he wanted was to go home, warm a bowl of canned soup, and collapse into bed. But fate, it seemed, had other plans that night. As Jack walked toward his truck, the dim glow of headlights flickered down the deserted road. A sleek black luxury sedan stood stranded under a lone street lamp, its hazard lights blinking weakly. The scene struck him as odd. Maplewood was the kind of place where luxury cars rarely appeared, let alone at midnight. Curiosity tugged at him, and his mechanic's instinct kicked in immediately. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and approached. Inside, he could just make out the figure of a young woman, sitting tensely behind the wheel. Her phone held up as though searching for a signal, but here, at the edge of town, cell service was unreliable at best. Jack quickened his pace, sensing the fear in her still posture and hesitant movements. Emily Anderson, the girl in the car, was trembling. Only hours earlier she had been at an upscale party in the city, surrounded by glittering lights and laughter. But on her drive home, the powerful sedan suddenly coughed, jerked, and refused to move again. Panic set in quickly. She had never been alone on a dark road at this hour, and worse, she had no idea how to fix even the simplest car issue. Wrapped in a fashionable but thin coat, her breath turned to fog as she tried to stay calm. When she saw the shadowy figure of Jack approaching, her heart leaped in fear. Who walks toward a stranded car at midnight? Her first instinct was to lock the doors, but something in his posture, tired yet unthreatening, stopped her. Jack raised his hand slightly, trying not to alarm her. "Hey miss," he called out gently, his voice steady. "Looks like you've got car trouble? I'm a mechanic. Want me to take a look?" Emily hesitated, staring at him through the glass. His clothes were dirty, his hair unkempt, and his boots left muddy prints on the road. He looked nothing like the polished men she was used to, yet his tone carried no malice, only a quiet confidence. The freezing night air seeped into the car, and Emily shivered. She weighed her options: sit here alone, praying for help, or take a chance on the stranger offering his hand. Finally, she unlocked the door with a reluctant nod. Jack gave a small smile, grateful for her trust. He fetched his battered toolbox from the bed of his pickup and knelt by the sedan. "Pop the hood," he said calmly, as if this were just another routine repair. Emily fumbled with the lever until the hood creaked open. Jack's practiced eyes scanned the engine bay under the dim glow of the street lamp. He noticed the batteries, corroded terminals, and a loose wire near the ignition coil. "Not too bad," he muttered, grabbing a wrench. Emily watched him curiously, hugging her coat tighter. She couldn't understand how someone so poor-looking, with tools that seemed ready to fall apart, could handle her luxury car with such precision. Minutes passed as Jack tightened connections, cleaned the battery contact with sandpaper, and adjusted the wiring. His hands moved fast, guided by years of instinct rather than fancy training. He glanced up occasionally to check on Emily, who shifted nervously in her seat, still unsure if she had made the right choice. But when Jack closed the hood and stepped back, wiping his forehead with his sleeve, he nodded. "Try starting it now." Emily bit her lip, turned the key, and to her amazement, the engine roared to life. Relief washed over her like a wave, and she let out a shaky laugh she hadn't realized she was holding. Jack chuckled softly at her reaction. "Told you it wasn't too bad. Just needed a little attention." He began packing his tools, as if this was nothing extraordinary. For him, it was what he did every day, fixing other people's problems without expecting much. In return, Emily rolled down the window, her earlier fear now replaced with gratitude. "Thank you. Really. I didn't know what I was going to do out here." Jack shrugged, his voice steady and kind. "Happens more often than you think. I couldn't just leave you here in the cold." His words were simple, but to Emily, they carried a rare sincerity she didn't often hear in her world of wealth and shallow compliments. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the soft hum of the car engine. Emily studied him closely. His face was worn, perhaps from years of hardship, but his eyes held a depth that unsettled her. He was poor, clearly struggling, yet there was a dignity about him that made her chest tighten. She reached into her purse, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. "Please, take this," she insisted, leaning toward him. Jack glanced at the money but shook his head firmly. "No ma'am, I didn't help you for that." "Keep it." Emily blinked in disbelief. Nobody had ever refused her money before. To her, money solved everything. Yet this man stood before her, tired and underdressed, refusing what most would grab without hesitation, embarrassed and oddly touched. Emily slowly put the money back. She opened her mouth to thank him again, but words escaped her. Jack gave her a polite nod, grabbed his toolbox, and started back toward his pickup. His footsteps echoed on the empty road, each step carrying the weight of a man used to walking away unseen. But as Emily watched his fading figure, something stirred inside her, a feeling she couldn't quite name. She had been rescued not by wealth or influence, but by the quiet kindness of a poor mechanic who asked for nothing in return. That midnight encounter, she realized, was not something she would soon forget. Emily's hand trembled slightly as she held out the crisp bill. Money had always been the language of her world, the way problems were solved, favors secured, and gratitude expressed. But Jack didn't even glance at it twice. His voice was calm, steady, almost humble as he said, "I help because I know what it feels like to be stuck." The words echoed in the cold night air, cutting through the silence in a way she couldn't ignore. For Emily, those words carried a weight she had never experienced. All her life, people had helped her because of her family name, or the money attached to it, but here stood a man, a stranger, covered in grease, and wearing threadbare clothes, who wanted nothing in return. It startled her, almost shook something deep inside. She stared at him, stunned into silence. Jack, on the other hand, didn't wait for her reply. He simply gave her a polite nod, as though the encounter was no more significant than helping a neighbor carry groceries. "You'll be fine now," he added gently, adjusting the strap of his toolbox over his shoulder. Emily, still processing his refusal, found herself blurting, "Wait, what's your name?" He paused, turned slightly, and replied, "Jack. Just Jack." No introduction with pride or arrogance. No need to impress. He walked toward his old pickup, his steps heavy with exhaustion. Emily sat frozen, her engine running, watching him disappear into the night. Something about his name, his quiet dignity, lingered with her even as she finally shifted the car into drive. As she drove off, the night seemed strangely different. The fear that had paralyzed her moments earlier was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar warmth. Emily thought about the way Jack's eyes had carried both fatigue and kindness. A man who had every reason to take the money she offered, yet chose not to. It unsettled her. In her world of privilege, money was power, control, security. For Jack, it seemed to mean very little compared to integrity. The highway stretched ahead, empty and quiet, but her mind was restless. She wondered what kind of life he lived. What kind of struggles had taught him to speak with such conviction? "I help because I know what it feels like to be stuck." The line kept replaying in her head, like a song she couldn't turn off. Meanwhile, Jack drove his rusty pickup back to his side of town. His modest home was more a shack than a house, its paint peeling and the roof patched with tin. The heater inside barely worked, and the worn couch in the living room sagged under years of use. He dropped his toolbox by the door, pulled off his grease-stained shirt, and collapsed onto the couch. He didn't think twice about the girl or her car. To him, helping strangers was part of who he was. Life had stranded him enough times. Broken roads, in tougher situations, so whenever he saw someone stuck, he couldn't just walk away. He didn't do it for recognition, and certainly not for money. It was just human. Jack leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling, unaware that this small act of kindness would soon change his entire life. Emily reached her family's mansion. Just past 1 a.m., the grand iron gates swung open as sensors detected her car, and the sprawling estate lit up with soft golden lights. Inside, the servants hurried to greet her, but Emily brushed them off, her mind still far away on the empty road where she had met Jack. She slipped into her room, tossing her heels aside, and sat at her vanity, gazing into the mirror. She saw her reflection, flawless makeup, elegant dress, diamond earrings, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hollow. That mechanic, Jack, had looked at her without awe, without envy. He had simply seen her as a person who needed help. It was unsettling and refreshing all at once. For someone born into wealth, used to being admired or envied, that kind of raw interaction was rare. The next morning, Emily woke up late. Sunlight streamed through her curtains, but she was in no rush. Normally her days were filled with brunches, shopping trips, or charity events arranged by her mother. But today, her thoughts circled back to Jack. She kept remembering his refusal to take her money. Who turns down easy cash, especially someone who clearly looked like he needed it? She found herself curious in a way she hadn't been about anyone before. Who was he? What was his story? Emily had all the resources in the world, yet she realized she knew nothing about people outside her circle. For the first time, she felt an urge not to dismiss what had happened as a one-night inconvenience, but to understand. Jack, meanwhile, rose early despite sleeping late. He brewed a weak cup of coffee, the kind that barely masked the bitterness of his reality. Bills lay scattered across the small kitchen table, overdue notices, utility threats, and an eviction warning that gnawed at the back of his mind. Yet, Jack wasn't the type to complain. He took a deep breath, pulled on his work boots, and prepared for another long day at the garage. As he passed the mirror by the door, he caught sight of his tired face, lined with responsibility far beyond his years. "Another day," he muttered, grabbing his worn cap. He had no idea that somewhere in the city, a wealthy young woman was replaying his words like a mantra. For Emily, the following days became strangely distracting. She went through the motions of her privileged life, but Jack's image hovered in the back of her mind. At dinners, while her friends gossiped about vacations and designer brands, she found herself thinking of his weary eyes and steady hands. At charity galas, where wealthy guests boasted about their donations, she remembered Jack's refusal to accept even $100. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she began to see her world differently. Was kindness really about money, or was it about moments like the one she shared with Jack, raw and genuine? Stripped of expectations, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. She didn't know how, but somehow, fate had drawn a line between their worlds. And soon, it would pull them back together in ways neither of them expected. The morning air carried a chill as Jack opened the doors of his small garage. He had barely rolled up the shutters when the low hum of a luxury engine drew his attention. A sleek black car, polished to perfection, pulled up in front. Jack frowned, wiping his hands on a rag, unused to such expensive machines, stopping in his part of town. When the rear door opened, his heart nearly stopped. Out stepped a tall, elegant woman, dressed in a tailored coat and heels that clicked sharply against the pavement. Jack instantly recognized her, Mrs. Anderson, the woman who practically owned half the factories and warehouses in the county. Her face was in newspapers, on billboards, and in every business journal that came across his counter. Jack froze, where he stood, wondering why someone of her stature had come here. To his rundown garage. For a moment, Jack feared the worst. His mind raced. Had he offended her daughter by refusing the money? Was she here to accuse him of something? He wiped the grease from his palms nervously, trying to keep his composure. Mrs. Anderson approached with calm, deliberate steps, her presence commanding without even trying. But her expression wasn't hard or angry, it was thoughtful, almost softened in a way that surprised Jack. When she finally spoke, her voice carried warmth rather than authority. "You must be Jack," she said, her eyes scanning the humble garage before resting on him. Jack nodded stiffly, unsure what to expect. "My daughter Emily spoke of you," she continued. "All night. In fact, she told me about the man who helped her when she was stranded, the man who refused her money, yet gave her peace when she needed it most." Jack blinked, stunned into silence. The words felt unreal. This woman, who had entire industries at her fingertips, was here to talk about a small act he thought was nothing more than ordinary kindness. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "Ma'am, I just did what anyone would have done," he muttered, lowering his eyes. But Mrs. Anderson shook her head slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile. "No, Jack, most wouldn't. Many would have taken the money, or worse, taken advantage of the situation. But you didn't. Emily said you spoke with honesty, that you reminded her there's still goodness in this world." Her words carried a sincerity Jack didn't expect. She wasn't here to scold him, she was here to thank him. And that realization unsettled him even more than if she had been angry. The garage felt strangely small with her presence inside it. Jack motioned awkwardly toward the bench, offering her a seat, but Mrs. Anderson declined, standing tall with her hands folded in front of her. "I built my life in business, Jack. People don't often do anything without expecting something. In return, even kindness, more often than not, comes with strings. But Emily," she said, "your kindness was different. That it was honest." Jack rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable with the praise. "I don't know about that," he said softly. "I just know what it feels like to be stuck. Sometimes all a person needs is a little help." His voice was quiet, but his words carried the same weight that had struck Emily the night before. Mrs. Anderson studied him closely. She was used to boardroom negotiations, to people groveling for opportunities, to flattery that felt more like strategy. But Jack was different. His clothes were worn, his hands calloused, yet his dignity stood taller than the luxury car parked outside. "Tell me, Jack," she asked gently, "why did you refuse Emily's offer? You could have used that money. Anyone could see that." Jack hesitated before replying. "Because it wouldn't feel right. I help people because I've been in places where nobody came. I don't want gratitude bought with bills. I just want to do what I can. That's all." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Mrs. Anderson felt herself disarmed, not as a businesswoman, but as a mother and as a human being. Jack expected the conversation to end there, perhaps with a polite thank you, before she left, but instead, Mrs. Anderson stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You may not realize it, Jack, but what you did has touched my daughter deeply. Emily has grown up in privilege, shielded from the realities of struggle. Yet last night, for the first time, she spoke of something real, something meaningful. She admired you, not your work, not your tools, but your heart." Jack's throat tightened, unsure how to respond. Praise wasn't something he was accustomed to. Life had taught him to expect criticism, indifference, or at best, a nod of approval when he fixed a car correctly. Having the wealthiest woman in the city stand in his garage and commend his values felt surreal. Almost dreamlike. The conversation stretched. And Jack slowly began to see a different side of Mrs. Anderson. Beneath her polished exterior, she carried the concern of a mother who wanted her daughter to see the world beyond riches. She explained that Emily often struggled to trust people, that she lived in a bubble where sincerity was rare. Last night, Mrs. Anderson said softly, Emily felt something she had never felt before, safe, without conditions. That's why I had to come here myself. Jack swallowed hard, humbled beyond words. He couldn't imagine how his small act, one he thought insignificant, could ripple into something so powerful for another family. Mrs. Anderson finally offered a handshake, her grip firm yet genuine. Jack, I came here not just to thank you, but to let you know your actions matter. Even when you think no one notices, Jack met her eyes, seeing the sincerity there, and for once, he allowed himself a small smile. Thank you, ma'am, he said quietly. But I don't need recognition, as long as Emily's safe. That's enough. Mrs. Anderson's eyes softened at his words, and she nodded, understanding. With that, she returned to her car, leaving Jack standing in the doorway of his garage, watching the sleek vehicle disappear down the road. As the engine faded into the distance, Jack leaned against the doorway, still processing what had just happened. Life rarely gave him surprises, and when it did, they weren't pleasant ones. But this morning had been different. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him not as a poor mechanic, not as a man barely scraping by, but as someone whose choices mattered. He didn't know what the future held, but something told him this was only the beginning of a story larger than himself, one that fate had just begun to write. Mrs. Anderson's words lingered in the air, heavier than any offer Jack had ever heard. He stood frozen in the dimly lit garage, his chest tightening as her gaze pierced straight through his hesitation. You may be poor, Jack, she repeated softly, but you're richer in values than many men I know. I want to help you build the future you deserve. Jack opened his mouth, but no words came. He had lived a life where dreams were luxuries, where survival took precedence over ambition. To hear such a declaration from the wealthiest woman in town felt impossible, like the universe was playing some grand trick on him. Yet the sincerity in her voice made it undeniable. She wasn't offering pity. She was offering belief. Jack's mind raced with questions. What did she mean by helping him? Was she talking about money, a job, or something else entirely? He rubbed his hands together nervously, the grease on his palms smudging like his scattered thoughts. Ma'am, he said slowly, I don't know what to say. I've never been offered something like this before. Mrs. Anderson stepped closer, her tone calm but resolute. Say yes to believing in yourself, Jack. That's all I ask for now. Her eyes softened, almost motherly. Emily sees something in you, and truth be told, so do I. Men like you are rare, and the world needs them in places bigger than this small garage. The mention of Emily stirred something in Jack he hadn't realized was there. The memory of her nervous eyes at midnight, the relief that washed over her face when the car roared back to life. The way she whispered his name before leaving, all of it replayed in his mind. He had thought their encounter was fleeting, a brush between two lives destined never to cross again. But now, it seemed like fate had drawn a different line, one that connected their worlds in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Jack took a deep breath. Mrs. Anderson, I don't know if I'm the kind of man you think I am. I'm just a mechanic, that's all. Her response came swiftly, firm, yet kind. You're wrong, Jack. You're a man who stands by principles when no one is watching. That's worth more than 1,000 titles, and I want to give you a chance to rise. She gestured toward the black car outside. Come with me. Let me show you what's possible. Jack hesitated. His small garage, though rundown, was his world. It was where he had poured years of sweat, tears, and late nights. The idea of leaving it behind, even for an hour, filled him with unease. But the conviction in her eyes reminded him that sometimes, life only changed when you dared to step out of the familiar. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Jack nodded. All right, I'll come. The ride to the Anderson estate felt like a journey between two worlds. Jack sat stiffly in the back seat, his grease-stained clothes a stark contrast to the polished leather interior. Outside the tinted windows, the town he knew so well disappeared, replaced by winding roads lined with manicured trees, sprawling fields, and iron gates that opened to reveal a mansion too grand to describe. Jack swallowed hard as the car rolled to a stop in front of the estate. He had fixed countless cars for the wealthy, but he had never been invited into their world. And now, here he was, standing at the threshold of the most powerful family in the city. Inside, the house was breathtaking. High ceilings adorned with chandeliers, walls lined with paintings that probably cost more than his entire garage, and hallways that stretched endlessly. Jack tried not to stare, but everything screamed of wealth and privilege. Emily appeared from the staircase, her expression lighting up the moment she saw him. Jack, she breathed, almost in disbelief that he was standing in her home. For a second, her refined composure slipped and she looked more like the girl stranded in the cold night. grateful for the man who had helped her. Jack gave her a small nod, unsure of what to say. Mrs. Anderson led them to a study lined with shelves of books. She motioned for Jack to sit, while Emily stood nearby, her presence both comforting and unnerving. Mrs. Anderson folded her hands, and spoke with the precision of someone who had built empires. Jack, I have resources, factories, businesses, networks, but what I lack are people I can trust at the heart of it all. Men who won't compromise values for gain. I want to invest in you, not with money alone, but with opportunity. You've built things with your hands. Now I want to see what you can build with your life. Jack felt the weight of her words settle deep inside him. All his life, he had been overlooked, underestimated, defined by his poverty rather than his potential. And now, someone was offering him a chance, not because of his wealth, but because of his character. He leaned forward, his voice low but steady. Ma'am, I don't know the first thing about running businesses. All I know is fixing engines and working hard. Mrs. Anderson smiled knowingly. That's where we begin. Hard work and integrity can be taught upward. What cannot be taught is honesty. You already have that, Jack. Emily, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke. Jack, last night, I saw in you something I've never seen before. You didn't see me as the daughter of Mrs. Anderson. You just saw me as a girl who needed help. That meant more than you know. Her words carried warmth, her admiration no longer hidden. Jack's heart skipped, caught off guard by her openness. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. I only did what felt right, he murmured. But Emily's gaze didn't waver. For her, that was exactly what made him extraordinary. The hours that followed blurred into deep conversations, plans, and hesitant dreams. Mrs. Anderson outlined ways Jack could train, learn, and eventually oversee projects that mattered. She wasn't offering charity, she was offering partnership, a hand up rather than a handout. Jack listened, overwhelmed, yet inspired. For the first time, he began to picture a life beyond patching cars for pennies. A life where his choices could shape more than his own survival. As the evening sun filtered through the tall windows, Jack realized this was no longer about fixing engines. It was about fixing the trajectory of his future. When Jack finally left the mansion that night, Emily walked him to the car. The silence between them was charged, not awkward, but filled with unspoken understanding. Before he stepped inside, Emily whispered, I'm glad it was you, Jack. Last night, and today. Jack met her eyes, and in that moment, he saw not just a wealthy girl, but someone who believed in him more than he believed in himself. He gave her a small smile, one that carried both gratitude and promise. Back at his garage, Jack stood outside, under the stars, the same sky that had witnessed their first encounter. Everything looked the same, the cracked walls, the oil stains, the flickering light above the doorway. Yet nothing felt the same. Life had shifted. He remembered Mrs. Anderson's words. You're richer in values than many men I know. And for the first time, Jack allowed himself to believe it. He wasn't just a poor mechanic anymore. He was a man standing at the edge of a new destiny, one carved not by wealth, but by the richness of his heart.